Chaos has been erupting into full view at the top of the Pentagon in the last day, and the pressure is right back on Pete Hegseth, with calls from Trump loyalists to get rid of him. Dysfunction, firings, purges, more leaks of sensitive operational plans, all the details on that to come. First of all, a bit of context, because it's hard to understate how damaging all of this is to the country at large. The United States military is, of course, the most powerful and experienced in the world by far. It has over 2.9 million employees in total, including 1.4 million active duty personnel. It faces a vast threat landscape in a rapidly changing world and has the solemn responsibility to keep the people of the United States safe in the face of it all. So, a kind person would suggest that it was a bold move of President Trump to put in Pete Hegseth, a Fox News television presenter, to run the whole thing. After all, if you look at the best evidence business literature on how to turn around large organizations in need of new direction, which we're told was the mission, it's pretty unanimous that the first thing you need to do is to hire the very best people to lead the operation. Get the right people on the bus, as Jim Collins wrote in his seminal work, Good to Great. This was theoretically in line with the Trump mission, as described, because, as we know, it was all very anti-DEI, which it saw as hiring less qualified people just because they ticked certain identity boxes, rather than hiring purely on merit. Well, unfortunately, the mission as described and the mission as executed in practice could not have been further apart. Slavish loyalty to and hilarious fawning over Donald Trump, along with the willingness to sign up to a fantasy version of recent election history, these seem to be the main tick box requirements.
Thank you for your leadership and thank you for everything you're doing.
I want to thank you for standing up to the Chinese Communist Party.
I want to thank you as well for the shipbuilding.
Your vision is a turning point and an inflection point in American history.
Your leadership at the border, absolutely remarkable.
What you're doing now, I think, is a great service to our country, but ultimately to the world.
And Mr. President, thank you for having the courage to do it and leading the way for all our warfighters.
The problem is those features alone actually select for the opposite of merit and competence, since highly competent people generally have too much self-respect to debase themselves in that way. But in any case, if you have an organisation of millions of people in whom discipline, skill and execution are all mission-critical requirements, putting someone in charge of that who has no experience of leadership anywhere near that level, kind of asking for trouble. And making that person someone who is arrogant and unself-aware, you might think would be guaranteeing disaster. And that brings us to where we are today. In the last 24 hours, there have been two new revelations. First, on sensitive operational information. So we already saw how Hegseth was at the pointy end of the so-called Signalgate scandal, texting some of the details of a forthcoming military attack to a group on the third-party app Signal, a group that, in that case, accidentally included a journalist, added by another of the highly competent top-level officials. At least that group was only supposed to include top-level officials, even if some of them wouldn't have been expected to be on a need-to-know list when it came to that military operation. Well, it turns out now that roughly the same time, so before the details of the other one had become public, Hegseth shared similar information with a different Signal group chat. Only this group included his wife, his brother, and his personal lawyer. The information that these people got to see was basically the same attack plans that he shared with the other group that was made public. Now, it's not quite as bad as that sounds. I mean, not quite, because his brother and personal lawyer are both employees of the Department of Defense. But that said, there is no suggestion they were remotely close to a need-to-know list for the operation that he was telling them about. In this case, the chat was carried out on his private personal telephone, rather than his government-provided one. Just remember the evidence discussed a couple of days ago, how at least one of the Doge people has demonstrated that they've likely been compromised by Russian hackers with the equipment that they were using. So the Russian hackers, well, they haven't been sitting back while all the press stories have been detailing just how amateurs are now blundering around the top reaches of government. So anyway, that's the first revelation. It's kind of just an extension of the old story, highlighting that it was slightly worse even than we realised at the time. This latest version has of course been denied by the administration, so the spokesman Sean Parnell, but then that's pretty much what they said about the first one, and the full text was then made public to show everyone who had eyes to see that the denials were just flat out lying. The second revelation has been just how much total chaos and dysfunction the Pentagon has descended into, with Hegseth in control. John Ulliott, the former chief Pentagon spokesman who resigned from his position last week, wrote a piece for Politico where he described what he'd seen, saying that the dysfunction at the DoD is, quote, now a major distraction for the president, who deserves better from his senior leadership. Not entirely sure I'd agree that he deserves better. I mean, he picked the guy in spite of the blindingly obvious disqualifying features. You might say the president deserves exactly this. It's just the country that might deserve better. But I relatively digress. Ulliott talked about how there had been near collapse in the Pentagon's top ranks. He said this: on Friday, Hegseth fired 3 of his most loyal senior staffers. In the aftermath, Defense Department officials working for Hegseth tried to smear the aides anonymously to reporters, claiming they were fired for leaking sensitive information as part of an investigation ordered earlier this month. Yet none of this is true. He then talks about how at least one of the staffers had been told he was cleared of any wrongdoing. At the point of the firing, they had not been given a lie detector test, which was part of the investigation process. Unfortunately, he went on to say, Hegseth's team has developed a habit of spreading flat-out, easily debunked falsehoods anonymously about their colleagues on the way out of the door. And he summarised the overall picture like this: Hegseth is now presiding over a strange and baffling purge that will leave him without his 2 closest advisors of over a decade, Caldwell and Selnick, and without chiefs of staff for him and his deputy. And he added that key Pentagon reporters have been telling sources privately that there are even bigger bombshell stories coming this week. I would treat that last one with a degree of caution until such stories arrive. I say that because Ulliott's opinion piece is clearly drafted with the intent of being seen by President Trump and attemptedly influencing Trump to get rid of Hegseth. I think there are lots of reasons to think that might be a good idea, as you will have picked up from what I said at the start of this video, but you would still be aware that this is a campaigning document we're seeing, so it is to be treated with a degree of caution in at least some of its claims. We do, after all, want to know what's actually true, not just embrace the whisper of a suggestion of what we might wish to be true. So Ulliott goes out of his way to praise Trump, because of course that's the entry qualification for any attempt to influence him, and seeking to impress upon Trump the qualities that he needs Trump to self-identify with. So he said this: President Donald Trump has a strong record of holding his top officials to account. Given that, it's hard to see Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth remaining in his role for much longer. We might say that Trump has let's be generous and say, a mixed record of holding officials to account, unless you include firing people for not going along with batshit crazy demands, which did happen a certain amount in his first term. But by praising him for that sort of strength and saying that, given that strength, it's hard to see Hegseth holding on, it's as clear an attempted manipulation of the easily manipulable as you could see. Ulliott goes on to highlight how loyal he was to Hegseth. He had, after all, written an op-ed during Hegseth's confirmation hearings, gushing about how he would be the right person to lead the Department of Defence. So the spirit of his critique is that it's offered more in sadness than in anger, and he says that Hegseth had followed horrible advice from his public affairs team. And then he goes back to more flattery and projection towards Trump, saying this: one reason the American people gave Trump a conclusive victory last November is that he's not a go-along, get-along creature of the Beltway, like many of his recent predecessors, but rather a shrewd businessman who expects results and holds his team accountable for serious mistakes that occur on their watch. Exactly the same sort of manipulation. Trump will fire Hegseth because he's shrewd and he expects results, not because he's highly suggestible. And he goes on painting that picture. Just ask Cabinet Secretaries Jim Mattis, Mark Esper, Rex Tillerson, David Shulkin, Tom Price and Ryan Zinke. They, like Hegseth, are all good men and patriots whom Trump dismissed in his first term when he found their performance wanting. This last bit's important because Trump clearly likes Hegseth, so Ulliott is impressing upon him that he is such a great and a tough leader that he doesn't let such sentiments get in the way of doing what needs to be done. And he then goes for even more of Trump's buttons with this passage. Biden did the opposite. Biden held not a single one of his team accountable and just let them skate. Trump, of course, is always going on about how terrible Biden was, so this comparison is designed purely to get exactly that kind of reaction out of him. And then he finishes with more Trump flattery in the same vein. So, will it work? Trump is certainly manipulable. I mean, all you have to do is see his reaction to some of the hysterically transparent prods sent his way occasionally by Vladimir Putin, like when Trump was gushing that in his telephone call with Putin, the Russian leader had even used Trump's own campaign slogan, saying that they both wanted to see a return to common sense. On that showing, you would say Pete Hegseth is not long for his job. But that said, an op-ed on the Politico website is not the optimal placing for such a piece. Kind of too close to the so-called fake news mainstream media that Trump has been assiduously training his followers to completely ignore and disregard. Trump is particularly determined not to have hostile media coverage push him into firing his own choices. The general MAGA right watchword has been never apologise, never explain. And you can already see some of this in the tweets about this case. This was forged, of course, during the heights of cancel culture years ago, when people who found themselves at the heart of Twitter storms or the equivalent often found that when they did the penance that was demanded of them for whatever transgression they'd made, it made no difference anyway. Now, look, you can accept or reject that whole dynamic from a few years ago. The point is, it's not supposed to be the same as public accountability for the holders of high office in government. I mean, it's not supposed to be. So, we'll see. The key factor will be just how much of the chaos described at the Department of Defence has been visible and causing problems for the administration behind the scenes. If it really has been as big and chaotic a problem as suggested, then the article could conceivably be the straw that broke the camel's back. Thing is that Trump will be highly resistant to taking action unless he really has to, because having to fire Hegseth so quickly would be an admission that he made a bad choice. Bearing in mind he made a whole bunch of controversial appointments, so he could well fear that it would be opening the floodgates. Because do we think that everything's going swimmingly in all those other departments? Clearly not. So it could unravel in a devastating way if it gained momentum. Trump will be particularly unwilling to take action if there's any hint or suggestion that he's doing so thanks to that mainstream media pressure. And of course the media, with the exception at the time of shooting this video of Fox News, are covering this story quite a lot. So it becomes the sort of barrage that he makes a point of resisting. It's worth noting that Hegseth is currently under investigation by the Pentagon's Inspector General for his original use of Signal. So the result of that investigation could be used as the cover to get rid of Hegseth if Trump should decide to do so. But none of that would erase the bigger theme of the incident. Unless the laws of gravity are going to be abolished, that is the theme that is likely to trail Trump throughout the rest of his presidency.